Dear viewers, a very warm welcome to OBN Horn of Africa's Talk to OBN talk show. Today, in this edition, we'll be talking about one of the very current affairs and one of the very pressing issue. Obviously, Ethiopian government has recently raised the need for Ethiopia to get a seaport access, and we'll be discussing the ins and outs of this logic with a long-serving political economy analyst, Dr. Lawrence Freeman. Doctor, thank you for joining me.
Glad to be with you today.
Let me begin with this one. What difference will it make being landlocked and having access to seaports? Can you do a comparison?
Ethiopia, I believe, is the largest landlocked country in the world. And of course, until the creation of Eritrea in 1993, it had a coastline along the Red Sea. Now, this creates a difficulty for Ethiopia to transport and export and import its goods. Various surveys have shown that landlocked countries suffer anywhere from 15 to 20% decrease in potential wealth and production because they don't have a viable port that takes them onto major waterways. For Ethiopia to develop and expand and industrialize, it definitely has to improve its capabilities of exporting and importing, which would require a significant access to the Red Sea.
In your exclusive interview with the Ethiopian news agency lately, you've said Ethiopia has got historical and geographical background to quest access to the port. And can you explicitly analyze or put the geographical and historical background of having the ultimate right to claim such inquiry?
I did in my interview with Ethiopian news agency say that there were, quote, historical rights. My view is that it's obvious to me as a physical economist that giving Ethiopia having access to a well-established and modernized port on the Red Sea is in the interest and benefit of all the nations of the Horn of Africa, especially, and in East Africa generally. And there's many different ports that could be used for this purpose. Ethiopia is the largest economy. It's larger than Kenya. It's the most industrialized, although very poorly, it's still the most industrialized economy in the Horn of Africa and East Africa. Therefore, the growth of the Ethiopian economy is to the benefit of all the nations in the region. And therefore, it is very useful for heads of government, sovereign nations, to sit down and negotiate this kind of port access because it's in everybody's interest. Unfortunately, people don't think this way. They don't think ahead of what economic development could be in 10 to 20 years. And they think very narrowly and they often think nationalistically, but they don't think in terms of how do you provide a rising standard of living for your people into the future. And you do that by economic growth. And Ethiopia is the country that's supplying the engine of economic growth for East Africa. And therefore, this should be negotiated.
Well, your expertise is in area of politics and economy. And technically speaking, what does it mean by physical economic growth? Having access to the seaport would leverage, physical economic growth, let alone Ethiopia. It would boost up, the benefit of Horn of Africa. You've mentioned this in your interview with that of Ethiopian news agency. The technical aspect of physical economic growth, what does it mean by?
It means that we're concentrating, when people use the word economy, oftentimes they're referring to money made on stock markets, money made in day trading, money made by leveraging, money made by speculation, money made in derivatives. I'm not interested in any of that. That's money. What I mean by physical economic growth is those areas of the economy which actually produce the wealth, physical, tangible wealth needed for the population to grow and grow at a higher standard of living. What is our food yield per hectare? What is our energy consumption per capita? What is our energy consumption per hectare? How many railroads do we have per square area of land? These kinds of considerations. How many modern ports do we have? Modern airports, physical wealth, so that a government that is thinking ahead for the future of its nation says, well, what kind of investments, what kind of inputs do we have to make today that will lead to greater wealth production 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 2 generations from now? And that's what Ethiopia is trying to do. So, given its potential, if it's going to grow and expand, which it has to with 120 million people, which will be growing to 150 million soon, then you need probably more than one access route to the Red Sea. You probably need more than one port. There's a whole series of ports along the area, including the Lamu port in Kenya, which Ethiopia could be connected to. Ethiopia is making investments in roads, they're making investments in railroads. These provide the connection from the manufacturing centers in the cities to the coastline, where they can export their goods around the world and receive imports. And this benefits the entire region. That's the point. That's how you have to think about it. You have to think in terms of how do we work together. Right now, the revenue from Ethiopia through the port of Djibouti, which is the main port, not the only one, that revenue is bigger than the rent on the leases for all of the military bases in Djibouti. But the cost to Ethiopia is very high. It's 1 to 2 billion per year to use that port. So that is too expensive, and therefore other arrangements have to be discussed.
Okay, let's talk about the means and ways in which this quest of Ethiopian government get a solution peacefully. Obviously, the Ethiopian government, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has said and initiated this issue and raised the need for Ethiopia to get a seaport peacefully. You see, I mean, there are stakeholders in the Horn region which claim the same quest, or those others take the Red Sea as their own belonging. In what way should be this quest of Ethiopia entertained in the eyes of those who consider the Red Sea port or the Red Sea or other ports as their own belonging? The mechanism of tabling in roundtable discussion.
As I said, the problem that we have in this and other discussions in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, and other countries, is people don't think about the future of their nation from the standpoint of economic growth into the future. You have to think about the future. You can't just think about where you are today. And therefore, having this discussion, as I understand it, Prime Minister Abiy has raised this discussion. From my standpoint, is a perfectly reasonable discussion to raise. But there are people who are going to use this to continue to cause tensions and potentially even war in the region. If you look at the recent article in the London Economist, they're interested in, they're age old for hundreds of years in Africa. Their policy has been divide and rule, and they're still practicing that. They want to increase the tensions between inside Ethiopia and between Ethiopia and Eritrea, Ethiopia and Somalia. In their recent article, they cite, they allege that in private talks, Prime Minister Abiy said that he will take a port by force in private talks, according to an unnamed Ethiopian official. Now, I've not seen any transcript of any speech by the Prime Minister that says he wants to use force, although this is circulates in the media quite widely. So this is very suspicious. But in terms of natural negotiations, we know that one of the biggest problems in Africa is the lack of inter-regional trade. Only 15% of trade is interregional, 85% is exported to the rest of the world. Look at the Horn of Africa. We have the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is already exporting electricity to Djibouti, to Kenya, to Sudan, and will export more as more turbines come online in the next 2 years. So you already have the framework for regional development. So let's add on now port development. Let's add on transportation. Let's add on railroad connections. And this is how we build up the regional trade. If we go beyond the Horn, you have Kenya, you have Sudan, then you go further out, you have Uganda in the south. You have other parts of the country, of the continent, where trade can expand to, and railroads should be expanding across the entire continent. So this is a very natural process to work this out. And as I understand it, the Prime Minister is discussing a transactional relationship. You let us release this port from you for X number of years, you can have an partial investment in Ethiopia, or partial investment in Ethiopian Airlines, or partial investment in the GERD. So it's transactional. It's not seizing, it's not conquering. It's a financial arrangement that the government is trying to work out with its neighbors. And it's in the interest of everybody. That's the key point, that this will help expand the income and revenue into Djibouti, into Somalia, into other areas by the trade that will pass through the port. So from my standpoint, it's a very obvious solution, but other people want to use it to cause tensions in the region. And we don't need any more tensions in the Horn of Africa.
Okay, Professor. Thank you for raising the media propaganda hybrid warfare in connection with the Prime Minister's initiation of accessing the seaport. Obviously, the PM declared to members of the parliament in the very first day. Then various media tried to simmer propaganda out of this Ethiopia's government's initiation. Can you just tell me, the stand of the Prime Minister, the intonation in which he explained the need for accessing the seaport? Is that mongering war or accessing the seaport peacefully?
I don't read Amharic, but what I've read, and read the sections of the Prime Minister's speech to the Parliament, is that the Prime Minister is putting, as we say in America, putting the issue on the table. Okay, we have a problem. We're spending $1.5 to $2 billion a year, Ethiopia's spending, to the most expensive port, which is the port of Djibouti. Now, this is still a very important port. And obviously, there's been a railroad connection made from Djibouti to Addis Ababa. But this is he's analyzed correctly, this is too much money. So we have to work out a less expensive region, a less expensive port. There are several potentials. They're all different distances. You have to build infrastructure to fully build the trade route, the transportation route to those ports. Some of those ports will have to be modernized. But you have to look at the whole region. Look at Eritrea. Look at Somalia. Even look at Somaliland. Look at Kenya. And we have to see how do we utilize our resources of the region to improve the standard of living of over 200 million people living in East Africa. So this is a very realistic, plausible, understandable issue to raise. The telltale sign for me that there's an operation against this, and I look for signs that tell me how certain players and actors are proceeding. Just like I was the first one to analyze the regime change intention of the war with the TPLF several years ago. If the London Economist, which is a branch of British intelligence, always has been, is putting an article out that where they won't quote accurately the comments made by the Prime Minister, but they allege through an unnamed source that he plans to use force to acquire a port. This tells me, this gives me my political nose, smells right away there's an operation. And there's a continued operation internally through ethnic nationalism and externally to continue to disrupt the forward progress that Ethiopia is trying to make as an emerging developing nation. And from my standpoint, I support development. Development is a human right. And in this case, it's in the interest, the self-interest of every nation in the region to help the Ethiopian economy expand. People don't think. They don't understand economics. They don't understand politics the way I do. And therefore, they can't conceive of how we can develop a policy that everybody benefits from. And those who want to disrupt that are against the interest of East Africa and all the people who live there.
Okay. I mean, many economists, including yourself, Professor Lawrence Freeman, always appreciate Ethiopia's fast-growing economy, and Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa and the fast-growing GDP growth in the world. And on top of this, having this port, to what extent would the economy of the country accelerate more than the ever existed magnitude or the pace in which the economy is going so far?
I don't particularly believe in the accuracy of how the IMF and the World Bank and these financial institutions measure the economy. So I don't agree with everything that they put forth in terms of how they say GDP is growing. What I look at is what we discussed earlier. Is the standard of living of the Ethiopian people improving? Is there more physical wealth produced, more products to be consumed by the population, more energy produced, more available transportation? And what is the cost of those physical products? Now, if Ethiopia is paying the highest cost to use the port in Djibouti, that is a negative that draws away from the wealth of the economy. So what is the fair cost? I don't know. How many kilometers are we traveling? How many tons can the port handle? Djibouti or other ports? How much can be exported? If Ethiopia is going to increase its manufacturing capability, it has a small manufacturing capability. Nevertheless, it's larger than many other nations. All of Africa has been destroyed for hundreds of years by not being allowed to have a manufacturing sector. That's one of the most glaring deficiencies in Ethiopia and all of Africa. So we have to build up the manufacturing center. We have to industrialize the economy. We have to produce manufactured agricultural products, not just sell the raw agriculture. So all of this requires many ingredients. It requires energy, it requires land, it requires other resources and inputs, but it also requires transportation. So the cheaper your port product, the cheaper your shipment through a port, and the large amount of trade that your port can handle, and the closer it is to the centers producing those manufacturing and agricultural goods for export, then you increase the productivity of your entire economy, providing you're continuing to invest in your infrastructure, which Ethiopia is more than any other nation. That to me is what signifies Ethiopia's growth, is the railroad expansion, the road expansion, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam production of electricity. These are the key growth factors that indicate to me Ethiopia is playing a leadership role in Africa. And then, of course, if you add to this that Ethiopia is joining the BRICS in January, that gives a whole new potential in terms of allies and trading partners. But this all has to be understood from a physical economic standpoint to understand why the issue that's been put on the table by the prime minister is important. And unfortunately, as I say, we have many short-sighted thinkers who get caught up in various ethnic or nationalist arguments and don't think. And we've got to get people to think and think in the way I think to understand why this development is important to Ethiopia and important to Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia, and all the other nations in the region.
In his discussion, the premier has mentioned that Ethiopia has got many port alternatives. Why this media outlets trying to attach the case only to Eritrea in your thought?
Well, I already mentioned it. They want to cause divisions. They want to cause conflict. Because don't forget, when the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came into office, the first thing he did was establish better relations with the president of Eritrea. And Eritrea has a very important role to play in the region. Therefore, causing a conflict or trying to cause a conflict when one doesn't really exist, but trying to manufacture a conflict that puts the Eritrean president at odds with the Ethiopian president, this is a way of undermining the region. And this, don't forget, yesterday was the anniversary of the 1-year anniversary of the end of the war, the 2-year-long war, which had very harmful effects on Ethiopia and on the Horn of Africa. Now, are there people out there who want to create more tension? Do they want another conflict? Do they want a water war? Do they want a war over access to the sea? Ethiopia is about 60 kilometers of land, is about 60 kilometers away from the Red Sea. Surely we can work out a corridor. And if we work out a long-term arrangement, let's say hypothetically a 50-year lease or longer, then Ethiopia will make the investments into the infrastructure in that corridor and the improvements in that port. So it's a win-win for the people leasing it, and it's a win for Ethiopia, and new infrastructure will be provided as long as, if there's a long-term investment, then you can make a long-term lease, then you can make long-term investments. From my standpoint, this is sound economic policy.
Okay.
And those who oppose it are actually trying to weaken and undermine the entire 200 million people who live in East Africa.
Professor Lawrence Freeman, a long-serving political economy analyst from the U.S. Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you very much for our conversation.
Dear viewers, this brings you the end of our edition. Hope you had thoughtful information about the simmering propaganda on the quest of Ethiopian government to access Seaport and Professor Lawrence Freeman vividly put all the logic behind this quest of Ethiopia.